So we'll kick this second part of our population dynamics lesson off with just something very, very basic, which is just the ways to directly change population size. So reproduction is important. Births will increase or add to the population. And then conversely, deaths will decrease the population size. Immigration, moving into the population for better resources, some sort of draw will bring new individuals in, or maybe they're being driven out of another area, but that will increase the population size. And immigration with an E, the exiting, that will decrease your population size. And remember, anytime the size decreases, you're losing some genetic diversity. You're losing those genes from the gene pool. And when you add, you're gaining some diversity. You're adding to the gene pool. Size isn't the only thing that we're going to consider with populations. If we're looking at 3 populations of bears and they all have 100 bears in the same amount of area, so exact same population density, we might think that they're equally healthy populations. But what if I told you that population 1 has an approximately, or exactly in this case, equal number of breeding males and females, and 50 bears that are too young to mate? Whereas population 2 still has 50 members that are able to breed, but in this case 45 of them are males. So there is a great deal more males than females. It is not at all equal. And population 3 is different still. It's approximately equal numbers of males and females, but there's 70 breeding males and females, and only 30 of those bears are too young to breed and will be growing up to be breeding bears. So could you argue which of these populations is the healthiest? It's kind of a complicated picture. You might have some debate between 1 and 3. And so when we consider these sorts of problems, we use a graphic called the age structure graph, or sometimes it's called a population pyramid, but it looks like this. And so what they show you is that most growing populations have relatively equal numbers of males and females in each group. And then they have more young individuals than they have elders. And then you can also highlight which individuals would be of reproductive age. You can get a sense of birth rates, death rates, and life expectancy all by looking at age structure graphs. Different populations will adapt to different environments in slightly different ways. So let's just look at a couple different age structure graphs just for humans. So you'll see the same one you saw before, which is showing you rapid growth, where you have a large number of young individuals and smaller percentages of the population as you go up. So you've got that inward slope. The United States is growing slowly, so between the individuals that are too young to reproduce and those of reproductive age or maturity, it's about equal. And then in a decreasing population, a population that's decreasing in size like Italy, you're going to see smaller percentages of the population in those young age groups. So here's another graphic we'll use often with populations. This is giving you an idea of survivorship. So you see the y-axis increases by powers of 10, and then you're looking at percentage of maximum lifespan on the x-axis. And so some species adapt to their environment in a way that they are most successful when most of their infants live through infancy and childhood and reach that maximum lifespan or come close to it. So they're living into old age. Whereas others, most of their individuals die early, long before they reach 25% of their maximum lifespan. And then there are all kinds of spectrums in between. These are those that tend to be relatively equally likely to live or die at any point in their lifespan. So there are reproductive strategies that go along with these two extreme survivorship curves. And so type 3 survivorship curve goes with an R selected reproductive strategy. And so I think R for rapid. These guys are rapid reproducers. So they are dealing with high infant mortality. Often this comes in an environment that's very, very unstable. So you're looking at your mosquitoes where their pool or their pond might dry up at any moment. They reach reproductive maturity very quickly. That always makes me think of the fruit flies that we raised in like our classic college genetics course, because they spend about 4 days as larvae, 4 days as pupae, and then once they're adults, they can start mating in less than 12 hours. So every 8 to 9 days, you have a brand new generation of organism. And so that's your extreme type 3. They're having lots of young, they are not putting a lot of energy into caring for them, and they are the rapid reproducers. On the other side, you've got your type 1, which is K selected, and I'll explain where that K comes from in just a little bit. And those are your slow reproducers. So they have few offspring. They put a lot of energy and time into making sure that their infants get through childhood and reach reproductive maturity, and generally their reproductive age is later on in their lifespan. It takes a much longer time. So this is your large mammals, your humans, your elephants, things like that. Growing populations also tend to show one of two growth patterns. They can be logistic or exponential, and so we're going to show both of those patterns on a graph where size is on the y-axis and time is on the x-axis. So if you are looking at an exponentially growing population, it's going to start out small and gradually increase. And then, as the population gets bigger, they can have more and more and more offspring, so they go faster and faster and faster. So you can see that slope of that line start to get steeper and steeper and steeper. All organisms can show this pattern at some point in their life history in a particular place, because it is hard to grow quickly when you don't have very many members in your population. But with logistic growth, what you see is first the exponential growth and then a sloping off. And that point at which the environment can no longer sustain, or the point at which the environment can sustain that many individuals, that is our carrying capacity. So it's the amount of individuals an environment can support with the amount of resources it has at that time. So there's our carrying capacity. Now, these in real life, if you were going out and measuring population size, it would not be this pretty. You might see the population go above, and then they overshoot their resources and they fall below, and then they grow again the next year or mating period, and they fall again, and so they slowly oscillate towards their carrying capacity. And again, that carrying capacity can be known as K, and so there is a reason we talk about K strategists or K reproducers. These are the populations that tend to already be living right around their carrying capacity. So it is to their advantage to have fewer offspring because they don't want to overshoot that limit that they're already near. Here's what happens if you vastly overshoot the limit. So you can exceed your carrying capacity, but that leads to the depletion of resources. The resources can't recover. There are extreme amounts of competition. In this case, remember that big idea that no one population is in isolation. And so that leads to what we call a population crash. And that is not good. Yes, the population can recover, but it depends on how badly the environment's been damaged. It may or may not ever be able to sustain the carrying capacity that it could before, so that could lower the carrying capacity permanently. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about with populations is limiting factors. These are the things that impose limits on the size of a population. So you can almost imagine them as an arrow pushing down on that logistic growth, because they kind of help enforce that carrying capacity. And so these limiting factors can be density dependent or density independent. So one depends on density. They are limiting as the populations get larger. One is independent of density. It's going to be limiting at any time. And so I always think of this in terms of squirrels. If it would affect 5 squirrels the same way it would affect a population of 500 squirrels, it's probably independent of density. If it would affect 500 squirrels much more than it would affect 5 squirrels, then it depends on density. That group of 500 is much more densely crowded. So density dependent are going to be things like food, disease, and predation. It's much easier to spread diseases when you're packed closely together. Being high density as a population, especially if you're a prey population, can draw in predation. And then all kinds of food needs are harder to meet when you're competing with other members of your species for that nourishment. Density independent would be things like human actions. We can go in and clear cut a forest, and it's not going to matter how many owls are living in that forest. Their habitat is gone. So there's your density independent limiting factor. Also, severe weather, natural disasters, floods, tsunamis, droughts, they're going to be limiting independent of density regardless of density. There is a little bit of a pattern here. It doesn't always apply, but it is helpful to remember that density-dependent limiting factors tend to be biotic. Diseases, bacteria, they are alive. Predators are alive. Those plant resources for food are alive. And then the severe weather and natural disasters, those are mainly abiotic on the density-independent side. We, the humans, are the exception, yet again. But that is just the quick wrap-up of a way to remember the difference between density-dependent, mainly biotic factors, density-independent being mainly abiotic or non-living factors. And that concludes our population dynamics lesson. Thanks for listening. See you back in class.